Hey everybody, we are back in the Shanty. I know we're a day late and probably $1 short too. But we're bucking up on the end of ESTA. I've had some other things going on that I may tell you about someday and I may not. But ESTA did raise a couple of issues, but an issue that I want to talk about particularly that isn't specifically related to ESTA, but ESTA's raised the question again. So let me tell you what I'm talking about, okay? Now that I've got you all confused. In the Earned Sick Time Act, we've got these FAQs out there now that were published by Leo. And a couple of the changes that occurred in ESTA raise an interesting question with respect to the issue of front-loading and overuse of the sick time leave. If you go to the FAQs, you will see an FAQ that asks, is it permissible to front load? And of course, we all know the answer to that now. The answer is yes, you can front load. For a full-time employee, you have to front load 72 hours. For a part-time employee, there's a calculation. But you can now front load. But the FAQ specifically says you can front load the time, but the hours must be available for immediate use. That's a quote in the answer to the FAQ. In other words, I'm going to front load these 72 hours, and those 72 hours have to be available for immediate use. Now, on its face, it would appear to mean that means that if I'm an employee and it's whatever, my anniversary date, and you just gave me 72 hours of sick time, I can use all 72 hours right away if I'm sick. Right? But there's a there's another FAQ that creates some confusion with respect to that simple phrase, for immediate use. And that's question number 24. And I'm not going to read it for you. I'm going to paraphrase it. But it basically says, question number 24 says, if I front load, and if the employee uses all 72 hours right away, and if they then quit, can I go back and recoup the hours that they hadn't earned if I would have been accruing time instead of front-loading time? Now, I would take the position that the answer to that question should be no, you can't, because the earlier question and answer said that the 72 hours have to be for immediate use. You following me so far, or have I confused you? But that's not what Leo says. Leo says you can actually recoup that amount. You can recoup that amount. And you can take it out of the employee's last paycheck if the deduction doesn't take the employee below the minimum wage for that paycheck, and you've got written consent from the employee that's voluntarily given for the deduction. Okay? Prior written voluntary agreement for the deduction. That's the quote. Now, again, I'm not sure how that is consistent with the immediate use thing, but that's, believe it or not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is that issue of taking money out of an employee's paycheck, whether it's the last paycheck or a paycheck in the middle or someplace in between. All right? There's two statutes that we have to deal with, and they've been around forever. None of this is new. None of this is new. But a lot of people get it wrong. And they get it wrong all the time. And I've heard from a number of people over the years, well, I've been doing this forever and nobody's ever complained about it. Well, that doesn't mean you're doing it right. That just means nobody's ever complained about it. The two statutes that we're talking about when it comes to deductions are the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is a federal statute, and the Michigan Payment of Wages and Fringe Benefits Act, which is a Michigan statute. Now, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, we just have this general provision that you cannot deduct from an employee's paycheck if Doing so would take them below the minimum wage. A deduction for the benefit of the employer if doing so would take them below the minimum wage. So we can set that aside. No deductions that take an employee below the minimum wage if they're for the benefit of the employer. But then we've got the state of Michigan Payment of Wages and Fringe Benefits Act. And this is what I want to remind you of. That statute, MCL 408.477, specifically, among other things, deals with deductions from an employee's paycheck. And it allows you to take deductions from an employee's paycheck in 3 separate situations. We're only going to talk about 2 of them. The first of all, when they're talking about deductions, they're not talking about tax withholding or stuff like that. Those are deductions permitted, required, in fact, by law. They're also not talking about deductions that you take from an employee's paycheck pursuant to a collective bargaining agreement. Okay? Again, those are negotiated deductions, and you don't need an individual employee's permission to make those deductions because you have a collective bargaining agreement. What we're talking about is individual deductions from an individual employee's paycheck. So when we get to MCLA 408.477, which is Section 7 of the Act, we start with Part 1. Part 1 deals with deductions for the benefit of the employee. Okay? And it says this: except for those deductions required or expressly permitted by law or by a collective bargaining agreement, right? So again, we're not talking about taxes, we're not talking about union dues, we're not talking about stuff like that. An employer shall not deduct from the wages of an employee, directly or indirectly, any amount, blah, blah, blah. And here's the key: without the full, free, and written consent of the employee, obtained without intimidation or fear of discharge for refusal to permit the deduction. So in order to make a deduction for the benefit of the employee, you have to have consent, all right? Now we go to Part 2, Section 2 of that same section of the statute. Except as provided in this subsection and subsection 4 and 5 below, a deduction for the benefit of the employer requires written consent from the employee for each payment subject to the deduction. And the cumulative amount of the deductions must not reduce the gross wages paid to a rate less than the minimum wage, blah, blah, blah. Okay, those are 2 separate things. And it may not be obvious on its face how they are 2 separate things. But here's how they are, and I'm going to explain it to you. If you're making a deduction for the benefit of the employee, you need a general consent that's signed. I consent to you to deduct blah, blah, blah from my paycheck. All right? And you're doing that for my benefit because you're going to take the money and put it someplace for me. I don't know, 401k, right? To pay for my health insurance, okay? You're going to do that. Then you get a consent, and that's for the benefit of the employee because now the employee gets health insurance. But if you're doing it for the benefit of the employer, the requirement is different, okay? The requirement is different. Not only must you have that full free written consent, but you have to have a consent for each wage payment subject to the deduction. In other words, the way I read that is if I'm going to take money out of your paycheck, I have to tell you how much is coming out of the paycheck and what paycheck I'm going to take it out of specifically. That means that general release isn't going to work anymore. I've got to have a specific release to make the deduction. And the real challenge here is that the statute doesn't tell us when a deduction is for the benefit of the employee and when a deduction is for the benefit of the employer. Now, some of those things might be obvious, but many of them are not. So that creates an issue. Again, nothing new about this. This law has been around forever. So be careful before you start taking money out of an employee's paycheck. Okay? Be careful to make sure you're doing it correctly if you're going to do it at all. So give us a call before you start doing this stuff, or if you're doing it now and you want to talk about whether you're doing it right, give us a call and we can walk you through it.